Hi, this is Jorgen Hesselberg, and you are listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jay Hrcsko. Joining with me is a fellow board member, Andy Cleff.
Hey, Jay.
Hello, Andy. And the topic of this episode is we're going to talk a lot about flow. With us, we have a special guest, a good friend of mine, fellow Agile coach, Jeff Prey. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Jeff and I, I shouldn't say Jeff and I came across Jeff professionally. We share some like-minded interest in not only the arts, but quantum physics. We were talking about that right before recording started. And Jeff has a bee in his bonnet when it comes to the idea of flow. So after having this conversation with Jeff, he has come up with a couple of things which we don't see a lot of in the Agile world, he was gracious enough to send us a copy. So we wanted to talk through it. The first thing we're going to start with is we're going to start the conversation around Jeff came up with the idea of a flow manifesto. So we talk about the Agile Manifesto. We haven't touched it in ages. It has principles. It has values. Jeff did the same thing when it comes to the concept of lean and flow. And then we're going to dovetail that into another interesting conversation. Jeff has a theory around teaching the concept of flow to leadership, and maybe this is the Rosetta Stone to making your transformation stick. But before we go into that, we're going to go right into the manifesto itself. So, Jeff, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit of background, if you will, on the idea. So we all know the Agile Manifesto. Where did the idea of the Lean Manifesto come from?
It came from about 3-4 years ago. I was setting up a conversation between a large group of business individuals and a large group of IT individuals. And I had one chance at engaging them in a conversation where I could build kind of a consortium or a collaboration between business and IT to deliver value together. Up to that point, the business folks were essentially throwing things over the wall at the IT people, and the IT people were throwing things back over the wall at them. And it was that kind of back and forth that we were trying to repair by just getting everybody on the same page. And so, because it was a 2-day conversation, and I only had one shot at this. I had to take all the thoughts, all the ideas, and all the principles and everything that I had in mind, and I had to try to distill it down to one basic thing that I wanted to accomplish in this conversation. And so, Andy, if I was going to ask you, if you had an opportunity like that, what would be the one thing that you would try to accomplish in the conversation?
The situation is talking to business people, trying to connect them to IT.
Trying to connect business people to connect with IT so that there's a partnership in the delivery of value.
One of the things that we always fall back on is what are the business outcomes you're trying to achieve? Not outputs, but give me high-level outcomes that you want. And that will be our North Star. And we will judge everything else we do against whether we're moving towards or away from that. Okay,
that sounds great. And Jay, what would you do?
Probably pray and call you. Pardon the pun.
Well, touche. That didn't take long.
That was too easy.
And so, to that point, the tendency that I would have in that conversation is to go all agile on them, to say, oh, we were following a framework. This is the framework. This is what the roles are. These are the people within the roles, and so on and so forth. And instead of doing that, we simply said, what we're trying to do is we're trying to connect the development teams to the highest value within the organization. And we need your partnership to do that. And we created a very simple deck with exercises. It was actually a pretty fun day. And that was trying to distill those ideas into its most simple message possible. And so the first thing that I learned in that particular process is that simple is better than complex.
Absolutely.
Trying to get in there, packing, tons of information in a short period of time, these guys would have glazed over, and I think I would have lost them. The result was, though, that we created a tangible foothold that continued to grow even after I was not engaged with that team. And so I knew that I was kind of in the right direction. They started developing their own product management teams. They started becoming passionate about, in this case, epics and features. They started learning in terms of how to write epics and features and how to plan, how to think about planning them effectively. And it was just a kernel of growth that continued to grow and flourish. And so the one principal idea is that you, as a coach, you know that you're on the right track when whatever you've discussed has legs. If it's something that continues on, if it's something that goes on without you, you feel that you've accomplished something and something valuable and something that actually makes a difference, or what I like to say is moves the needle in some way, shape, or form. And so in conversations, in conversations with other coaches, such as Jay and other folks, we're trying to further refine what that is and make it the simplest, most simple idea possible. So the conversation is, really, if you take the Scrum guide and the manifesto, and then you're going to respective frameworks, and you have all these coachings and so on and so forth, what is the simple and continuous idea that's common to all of them? And the best thing that we could come up with in terms of these conversations when we're having these coaches basically this kind of, enjoying the conversation, is flow. That's the simplest common denominator between them all, because we're trying to accomplish the same thing. We're trying to accomplish the incremental delivery of value, breaking it into small chunks, and it's all reflected within the manifesto, delivering working software more frequently, breaking work into small chunks. You go into Renaissance work where you're trying to create the small batch size. You have the Kanban, you have the Scrum, and you have, even if you go to the scaled framework, it's all about flow. And so if we were going to talk this talk and we're going to try to create this dialogue, we felt that we had to actually document our thoughts in the simplest possible way. And so because we're Agile coaches, and the Agile Manifesto was so successful, and I actually looked up on the internet in terms of how to write a manifesto, which is kind of fun. You should try it sometime.
It's great that you mimic the Agile Manifesto and not the Communist Manifesto, or this conversation would go in a completely different direction.
20 words or less. And so we said, okay, so the first problem that we had was trying to have a definition of what flow is. Believe it or not, if you're talking about what lean flow is and trying to put it on the back of a postcard that you can send to somebody, it's very, very hard to find a simple definition of what flow is. And so the first challenge that the team had, because it was a group of people who were collaborating on this, was try to create a definition of what flow was that we all agreed to. And so essentially what we're saying is this flow is incrementally providing business value. It's not delivering software, it's not this, it's not that. The simplest possible thing is that we're incrementally providing business value. We're trying to make a difference in the marketplace. It's not delivery, which is kind of the waterfall mindset, but a rate of delivery. Small batches are delivered through the flow pipeline, change is embraced, and overall quality, velocity, and business satisfaction improves. A nice, simple definition, because all we're trying to do is to create a dialogue. Our intent was not to teach anybody anything. Our intent was not to produce a document that was awe-inspiring. Our intent was to create language within our constituency that would be supportive of their endeavors to create an agile process that enables people interactions and also enables the corporation to respond to the market. And so we broke that down into, again, just like the Agile Manifesto, and the intent was very obvious, that we broke it down into basically four basic values. And so what we're saying is that we're going to choose flow enabled by Agile leadership over project management delivery. And yes, Jay.
I love, and I'm going to say, Jeff, I love the fact that you start with the idea of leadership, right? Because we all know that leadership is vital to any successful transformation effort, to any successful enterprise organization endeavor. And the fact that you start with calling out leadership, that needs to be enabled by people in this, with this responsibility, not this role, because as Troy Lightfoot would say, leadership is not a title, it's a behavior.
Right.
The fact that you call that out early sets the table very early that if you think you're a leader and you're reading this, this is what you need to do.
Well, I've heard in a seminar, I heard a very prominent Agile spokesman say the role of leadership is to get out of the way. And I absolutely don't agree with that. I think leadership is critical. And I mean all leadership. I don't mean one person leading the whole show. I mean, there's a hierarchy of leaders that reflects the hierarchy of your organization. And they all have to be enabled, they all have to be empowered, and they all have to feel the confidence that they can make an individual difference within the organization.
Yeah, I want to jump in on a couple of things. The definition of leadership, I think the three of us share, it's at every level. And it's not a hierarchical thing, it's a behavioral thing. I suspect what you heard at that conference was the hierarchical approach to leadership, which is more managerial, perhaps. But even at the enterprise, you've heard people say the first thing you need to do is fire all the managers. Which is not necessarily the case at scale. Mm-hmm. Lots of chaos happens. But there's another piece about flow that I want to touch on before it falls out of my brain. The stuff that we're building has never been built before. It's complex, and there is this aspect of creative flow in the creative process. Before the show started, we were talking about pottery a little bit, and the artistic aspect of getting into the flow state is slightly different than how systems theory talks about flow, but I think they're compatible.
Oh, absolutely. And the other thing that we have to recognize is that leaders are smart, intelligent, transformational, good people. And the more we embrace leadership as a functioning, enabling role in our Agile adoption, the stronger we'll be as an organization. And I don't mean just one, I mean all the leaders working together.
Right, an aggregate, yep.
The aggregate of it. And so the first thing we're talking about is we're using the simplest possible language. And that's the key thing here, because we don't want to use a lot of words. We don't want to use a lot of ideas. We're saying flow is enabled by Agile leadership and over project-based management. We're going to talk about, flow is enabled, the value is customer value definition as small independent value over large interdependent value, waterfall type project management. You're prioritizing limiting work in progress and pulling when capacity is available over advanced loading by perceived capacity.
Right.
We know how that works.
Straight out of Kanban. I think I might have a rap album by that name.
It's so very true. I mean, we talk about, advanced loading by perceived capacity. That's the whole idea. And Johanna Rothman is the first one who introduced me to the idea of flow efficiency versus resource efficiency, and how a lot of older waterfall type managerial seats will look at things as, oh, well, Andy has 40 hours a week. I mean, to make sure he's busy that 40 hours a week. And we try to be efficient with our resources. Then you end up building stuff that nobody wants. You end up burning people out. And funnily enough, here we are talking about advanced loading. I just yesterday had a conversation with another gentleman who's in an LPM shop, a lean portfolio management shop. And he's telling me that the finance guy that he's working with is saying, no, we just fund teams. We just fund teams and trains. You don't need to worry about, clarity codes or project numbers, P numbers for billing and PeopleSoft. You don't need to worry about that. And then the same guy out of the other side of his mouth says, well, you loaded all your forecasts and your actuals don't match your forecasts. So what's going on here? So he rang me up and he said, what am I supposed to do? The same guy is telling me we're funding teams and trains, so don't worry about where you're, worry about front loading your estimates. And then on the other side of his mouth, he says, well, why doesn't your front loaded estimate match your actuals? And he said, what do you think? And I said, rather unhelpfully, I will admit, I said to him, there's this great TV show called Justified, Elmore Leonard. And Boyd Crowder, the antagonist in the show, had a remark where he said, a man who speaks out of both sides of his mouth deserves to have it sewn shut. And I think maybe this finance guy you're talking to, maybe we should send him that episode, because you're right. That's that old way of thinking.
Well, and that's okay. And I'm going to say, by the way, Jay, is that kind of thinking is okay. It's where people are. I think you and I, we talked about, a cultural shift being a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. You don't have the culture shift and then you see the results. You see the results and then you see then the culture shifts behind them. And so again, there's no name calling here in the Flow Manifesto. We're not trying to disparage anyone. In fact, we're trying to enable and empower everyone within the organization. And so the last thing is, and Andy, you'd be very happy with the last one, it's empowered teams to deliver valuable software continuously over large batch release, or delivering as a large batch, DevOps and DevOps enabling type of work. So again, there's nothing in the Agile Flow Manifesto which is essentially new. There's nothing terribly complex. It's just trying to make the language as simple and as concise as possible so that it can encourage that similar dialogue within our respective constituency.
So let's stick with the values for a minute. So when you bounce them off of somebody new, say either in technology or business, what kind of responses, what kind of facial expressions do you see?
That's a very, very interesting question. It depends on what their cognitive bias is. If they come from an agile or a coaching background, this is all old hat. In fact, it's even, let's say, it's mundane. There's nothing shocking here. If you're talking to somebody who still is thinking along the lines of waterfall and waterfall type delivery, it's almost like the best way to say it is, we have a blind spot in our eye, and if we turn just the right way, the world disappears.
Yeah.
And everybody's very polite and nice, of course, and that's not the point. The thing is that you can really tell where somebody's coming from by their reaction. If they get it or they ask questions, you probably think they're coming from more of an agile mindset. If they're basically challenging the very foundation of the conversation, they're probably coming in from a waterfall mindset. But again, that's also okay, having that type of conversation, because it's good to know where people are coming from, so that then you can ask them, or you can empower them or enable them in their next evolution or their next step that they need to do.
Yeah, there's a great phrase that I think it's Esther Derby and Don Gray put out there: center, enter, and turn. And so often, center, enter, and turn. Come in with a good foundation, knowing that you've worked it out, and enter the system and meet it where it is. And you talked about that a little bit earlier, Jeff. And only then can you turn them to see something new. So often we come in with the solution and you get resistance because you're forcing it. It's a push instead of a meet them where they are and move them. So,
although I do think there's value in terms of that, the courage and having the courage to initially introduce these ideas. And you don't take a lot of their time. I have a very funny had a very funny conversation with a relatively senior leader, and I said, I'd like to talk to you about flow, and I swear.
I'm not sure where this is going, but who told you about her?
like that scene in Airplane where the captain is walking through the airport and everybody's trying to hand him the flour so they can get the donations, and he starts throwing all the religious guys around. But to that point, Jeff, so I know from conversations with you outside of work that you, and we're not going to go through the flow principles because they're great, and I want to switch topics for 20 minutes in, but I know that this wasn't something you did in a vacuum. I know you did workshop this with a bunch of different people. Like, yeah, I know I got an early read on what you were proposing. And I know you've actually had this conversation with fairly senior leadership. And
Correct.
it was not thrown up upon. If anything, I wouldn't say it went over with great aplomb, but I think if I remember correctly, you actually told me that it was a positive interaction.
Right. What we see is when the language, so you basically introduce this conversation, and you have that uncomfortable moment where you think, like, you have an eye in the middle of your forehead or something like that. And then, and you say, that's okay. And then you just move on. And then a week later, you'll hear these same words being repeated back. You'll hear the conversations about teamwork and enabling flow and the purpose of what they're trying to do. And it's very rewarding when that happens. In this particular case, the person was saying, we have to have WIP limits within our portfolio Kanban. We have to have, prioritization. We have to have well-written features that we can actually demonstrate. And I'm going,
Hallelujah.
That's kind of a breakthrough moment, and when that can happen, and that's really the satisfaction of having these kind of conversations and so on and so forth, when those kind of breakthroughs do happen.
Have you had to sell the benefits of lean flow thinking at that level, or have you seen they get it intuitively?
I personally think that we should be always speaking to the benefits in everything that we do. If there's not a tangible benefit, if there's not a win-win situation, if it's not in that person's individual best interest, I don't think you should even make these recommendations. And so I instinctively go to the value statement for everything I do. If I'm coaching at the team level, if I'm coaching at a program level, or whatever, I'll always talk about the why, what the choices are, and then leave the conversation pretty much at that, without ever even making a recommendation. Because again, if we're going to empower lean agile leaders, if we're going to empower, and we're talking about empowering the lean agile leader, scrum master, and the RTE, and the director who manages the greater volume of resources at a program level, or higher than that, or even higher than that, we have to learn to trust them. We have to learn to listen to them. We have to learn to speak from a value-based proposition that enables them to do their job better, to serve their customers better, to allow the corporation to change in the marketplace in a more timely manner. And I think that's a very valuable conversation to have. So I very rarely will talk about flow as, quote unquote, an ideal that you have to do without understanding the details.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, Andy, if that resonates with you at all. I mean, certainly I respect your opinion.
It's often useful to know where it hurts so that you can position the why as a solve for that. If they don't see the problem they have, it's a tough sell.
Yeah,
but if they're suffering and experiencing some pain, this is offering an approach to begin to reduce that. Like, yeah, it takes forever, and when we finally ship it, we find out that half of what we built we didn't need. Interesting.
Precise. And it's where the person is, and meeting the person where it is, and trying to make it a value proposition for that individual or that group of individuals with team or otherwise.
Perfect. So, and you actually, thank you, Jeff, the great guess. You gave me the perfect segue without even really trying. So one of the other things that you shared with me that we've come across that I'd like to dig in a little bit, is the idea of leadership and flow. And again, just to summarize from my opening spiel, you're of the opinion that instead of teaching this agile stuff, right? And I know this is bad audio, I'm doing gratuitous air quotes. Instead of teaching agile stuff, the one concept we could teach leadership that would really lead to a successful transformation or change is the concept of flow. So before we go into the details, can you back us up and give us a little bit of the genesis about where that epiphany came from, where that eureka moment came from?
It's just a continuation of flow. Again, the pursuit that we're looking for here is finding the simplest ideas to describe a valuable outcome, without talking about, you know, frameworks, without talking about roles, responsibilities, and you know, and those complex pictures that we like to show folks. Trying to find the simplest possible language. And that expression extended to, well, what's the simplest thing that we're trying to enable from a leadership perspective? Because we all realize that the more the leaders engaged through the flow of the system, and not just a component like a team or even an art or a program, but from the idea to the delivery, the more leadership is engaged in the overall flow of that idea, the stronger the organization will be, the faster the organization will be, and the less stress and the less conflict that we have within the Agile adoption. For example, you might find yourself in a situation where leadership is very much of a waterfall or a project planning mindset, and the teams are Agile. And that's because teams are easy to stand up and to stand up as Agile. It's harder to basically stand up business and leadership. So therefore we stand up the teams first, and then we have this kind of period of conflict between the two organizations. And that's not a healthy thing. We want to be in alignment. We want to allow the idea to process itself as quickly through the organization until it becomes a valuable outcome for the business. And so again, this is just extending the idea of the Agile, of the Lean Flow Manifesto in terms of what is a real opportunity. And the real opportunity is, if you have 5 minutes to spend with a leader, what are you going to say? What are you going to talk about? What's the value proposition that you're going to present this person to say, I'd like you to listen to me because I think it's valuable for you to do so. You can say, here's my big picture and I all these thoughts and I'm super smart. Or you can say, you're just trying to enable flow. You have other people who have to be experts in Agile. Agile is very, very complex. Scaled Agile is very, very complex. There's many different perspectives. There's many different ideas. Even I've been listening to your podcast, and sometimes we'll have the guests having very different ideas in terms of, you know, what's Agile, what's not Agile. Mm-hmm. You know, there's no way that we can convey that level of understanding or knowledge to a leader.
Especially in 30 seconds, right? Like the elevator pitch. You're right. Yeah.
So what do you do? What's the simplest possible thing? Again, the idea is the simplest possible language. And the simplest possible language that I can imagine is flow.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about flow is flow touches everything. It touches the business. It touches the initial idea. It touches, I'm going to use the word epic. And then it touches the capability and touches the features, and it's delivered at the team level. It's delivered by DevOps. It's all working together to take a single idea through the system as quickly as possible.
Which is so important, because the longer it takes, the greater the risk of priority whiplash and waste comes into it. We were talking before the show started about physics, and I think, Jay, you brought in quantum mechanics. There's a wonderful quote by Einstein, who was asked, you know, if you had only an hour to solve a difficult problem, what would you do? He says, I'd take the first 55 minutes to define the problem. And then the last 5 minutes to solve it. And I'm wondering if as coaches and people in the elevator, you know, if we would better serve our audience by taking the first 4 minutes and asking questions and probing, where does it hurt? What problems are you experiencing? You know, and then take that 1 minute to say, yeah, flow might help. Got to go. My floor. leave them wanting more.
So the whole principle, so the whole principle, by the way, is that leaders would know flow, and leaders would then empower and enable teams to be expert in their particular Agile role. And I emphasize the word teams, not individuals, but teams.
Yes.
not to say that leaders can't learn Agile. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying is this, if you have only 5 things and you only have one thing that you can convey, talk about flow. And why? Because we have to prioritize our ideas. We can't just try to do everything at the same time. We have to have conversations about what's the most valuable outcome that we're trying to achieve, and take all those, the CD3 and the WizJeff type conversations where the cost of delay is computed by it being a valuable outcome, it's risk reducing, or it is otherwise enabling. I just forgot it off the top of my head there. But, you know, that's an expert conversation. That's, you know, those are people who need to be empowered to really understand the nuances, to understand their team decisions, to understand the properties of a Kanban board, for example, and to do so. The leader's there to basically enable that conversation. And the leader is also there to consume the metrics, to know how the flow is going. So then the leader can ask, how can we improve this flow? How can we remove this bottleneck? The greatest opportunity a leader would have is after the metrics find that there's something outside the organization, that they can actually take a hand and assist the organization, and being that servant leader model that we're asking the modern leader to be.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah,
You know, if you can help them visualize the total lead time, right, from concept to cash, and
right.
show them how it flows, and then bring in concepts like flow efficiency, I'm sure many of their eyes would open wide. They think, yeah, we spend 95% of our time in working states, when in fact, the system probably spends 5% of its time in working states and 95% queuing. You're like, that's why it takes so damn long?
I always think of one of our mutual friends, Andy, fellow coach of ours, talked about he did a value stream mapping exercise with the executives in his company. And he got C-level people in the room, marketing, finance, operations, whatever. And when they finished the exercise, the exact verbatim quote, this is not safe for work, the exact verbatim quote from the head of marketing was, "How do we make any fucking money?" Was the exact straight-faced quote this guy said, because their flow efficiency was so low. To your point, all the work was sitting in a queue state, in a wait state, and not actually getting out the door to the customer, which is where your bread and butter is.
Yeah. So exposing them to the concept of flow, really powerful.
Right. And the idea is that, yes, it's okay to have bad flow. We've gotten along for, you know, a very long period of time with waterfall and waterfall management and all these other things. I feel that if you give smart people visibility in terms of an opportunity, and that you have the type of culture where you're looking for constructive outcomes to problem solve, you're going to start seeing incremental and improved results across the organization. And that's why flow is so important to leadership, is because flow touches everything. And it's not just, I'm going to optimize my teams, or I'm going to optimize my program, I'm going to optimize my particular thing. You're going to try to be in harmony with the overall delivery of value from the entire solution. And the more we can enable that type of mindset, the more we can start to develop constructive behaviors, the more we can actually start talking about Agile principles and practices, and how valuable they are for solving one problem or one bottleneck, or another practice that will solve another problem or another bottleneck. We can basically diversify, we can focus, we can be flexible. And essentially that's what we're trying to do. So the paper basically talks about the value of flow from a leadership perspective. It talks about what are the basic principles of flow, with Reinertsen talking about small batch size. We're talking about limiting the work in progress, and then periodically inspecting. And I keep wanting to use the word inspect and adapt, and probably shows me later. But
say that 3 times, and Dean Leffingwell shows up with his hand out saying, "Yeah, you owe me royalties."
and then another thing that we have to talk about is that once flow is enabled, it doesn't mean that you're delivering the highest value. And
Yeah.
again, this is a leadership opportunity. You can have the greatest flowing organization that's putting out the wrong product if they're not connected with the business, if you don't have the right people in the conversation. And so further down on the paper, it starts saying that once you have flow established, then you have to work in terms of creating, connecting that flow to the highest value within the organization.
And
So,
then getting
again,
feedback, right?
Again, constant feedback, learning to actually demonstrate product instead of just taking a paper status report as an indication that you achieved the outcome. Actually sitting down and looking at the product, putting your hands around and saying, hey, this looks just like I thought it would. And what's the, the outcome hypothesis, and what's the leading indicator of the outcome hypothesis, and asking all those kind of questions. Again, getting into that complexity. But again, we're going to try to keep the language as simple as possible. Are we delivering regularly and consistently? Do we have predictable delivery of value? And the answer is yes. Or we're improving. Fantastic. Are we delivering the right product? How do we know we're delivering the right product? Have we tested and validated our assumptions and outcomes? How do we learn across the organization? Do I have a learning organization as a whole, or do I have all my work in progress at the same time, just planning for the end date? And these are the valuable outcomes that I'm hoping to encourage, simply to help organizations find that synergy and that teamwork that they need to establish to create these type of agile success stories.
Where are you getting resistance and or chaos when you begin to introduce this new way of thinking at enterprise scale? What's that first inflection point showing up as?
The first inflection point that's a very, very interesting question. It's normally at the boundaries between organizations. The boundaries between the capability and the feature Kanban boards. The capabilities from the program to the team level. It's where you have one group of people who are looking for a valuable outcome or trying to make the world a better place, and they kind of have to, bring others on board. And I don't even see that as resistance, by the way. I just see that as just another opportunity. So recently, the teams that I'm working with, having to reach out deeper and deeper into the business to have them help prioritize the work that they're doing. That's not an easy conversation. It takes a while for people to catch on, but because we're trying to do something constructive, and it's much more of almost an optimistic perspective in terms of trying to get better, it kind of helps bring those organizations in. And so I'm looking at the principle of learning by example, and maybe even a little peer pressure, instead of trying to think of it in terms of resistance or anti-patterns, which I think are essentially overused words within the Agile framework.
Yeah, there's a whole bucket of those.
Somewhere Chris Merman's ear just started ringing because Jeff, that's one of his pet peeves, is the abuse of the term anti-pattern, to the point where an anti-pattern itself is an anti-pattern is an anti-pattern. Like, he went Inception 3 levels deep. He's in the snow level. It was tough. He got squirrely one night. We had this conversation.
But I like the idea that it's a conversation between wanters and makers, and it's not easy, yet it's necessary to bring them together. And heck, they should be part of the same team. And so often it's business and technology as opposing silos rather than cooperating. And there again is yet another flow constrictor.
Yep. So I use flow so much that when I use the word flow, people tend to drink beer.
And these days, working from home, it's okay,
Drinking. All right. Jeff's mentioned flow again. Talk about it.
Yeah,
But,
every time Jeff says flow, finish your
we
beer.
do a
Drunk people
shot.
everywhere.
No, but I gotta say, so far it's been working out very well using the flow perspective for these conversations. I'm not saying it's the silver bullet. I mean, obviously there's many different approaches to coaching, and there's many different ideas and thoughts. But this
Yeah.
particular thought seems to have some legs.
There's a piece of it. So enabling flow, smaller batch sizes, connecting it to value. Now you get to the next question, and I think you address it somewhere as, okay, we have 30 things that could produce value. How the heck do we begin to prioritize?
I actually addressed that conversation. Number one, prioritization is critical. It's simply, I mean, if the COVID-19 taught us anything, some teams were struggling, for example, because they had a lot of work in progress. They weren't prioritizing. They were just looking at all the backlog. And all of a sudden, COVID-19 comes along, and then they have to drop everything that they're doing and do that. And that shift is very, very difficult. So the first thing that we did with those teams is we talked about, let's reduce your WIP. Let's assume that developers and QAs can only do one thing at a time, that you don't want to just queue work up for the developer, for the QA. You want to get the WIP down as low as possible so that you have the capability to adjust to this daily change request that was coming in. Very important, powerful change requests that the team needed to address immediately. So we positioned them to do so by limiting their work in progress and prioritizing. The principle is that if you are taking this from the top of the stack and something goes wrong, the only thing at risk is the last item on the stack, or the last few items on the stack. If you try to do the entire stack at the same time with the same delivery date, because everything is due at the same time, and something goes wrong, then the entire stack is then at risk. And so it's about risk reduction and trying to control that within your organization to the greatest extent possible. And so prioritization is a key tool in that risk reduction. So the better your prioritization is, the less risk that you're dealing with. The better your prioritization is, believe it or not, the stronger your relationship is with your business stakeholders. Because if your stakeholders are actually prioritizing for you, you say, I'm just an enabler here. I'm going to help you guys prioritize the stack of work, either at the feature level or prioritizing at the program epic level or the portfolio level. Then it's their decision. And they know that you're going to maximize your potential to deliver that first item, and then the second item, then the third item, and then the person who's lower down on the list, they understand where they stand. And they're not going to start, it's not going to be that massive conversation that consumes so much bandwidth from teams and program teams. It's going to be just, what's the first thing we're doing? Simplifies the conversation. What's the second thing we're doing? It simplifies the conversation, et cetera, et cetera. So to enable prioritization, the first rule is, let your stakeholders do it for you. Don't prioritize for them. The second rule of prioritization is, understand that prioritization is not easy. You have many competing things that your organization must do. So for example, you can't just say, I'm going to be working on the highest value item. Sometimes I have maintenance work. Sometimes I have architecture enabling work. There's other work that comes into the team that must be addressed. And by team, I also mean programs as teams, solutions as teams, and portfolio as teams. So let the stakeholders prioritize for you. Understand that prioritization is not easy, so it requires teamwork and collaboration. I just completely lost my thought. And there was another point here about prioritization that was super important that just completely left my mind right now. And I apologize for that.
That is not a surprise, Jeff. A lot of our guests are actually quite intelligent, and then they get lost in their own brain trying to figure it out. So I'm sure it is definitely in the paper. And
it is in the paper.
One list of priorities, not 2, 3, 4, right? Working off of one common list that everybody can see.
You know, you can't make a priority in 5 different places at the same time because it's the same as having no priority at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it's absolutely a critical function, and it's, again, because of the collaborative nature, it's so important for leadership to empower and enable this collaboration. If leaders come in and dominate the prioritization for whatever purposes that they have, then the team loses that empowerment, loses that trust, and the cost of doing that is actually much more than the value that that person gets for having that immediate sense. Right?
Yeah.
But
it's perfect. It's perfect. And I know Jeff, we've exhausted your brain. And I know it's getting late, and I want to be conscious of everybody's time. So first of all, on behalf of Andy and myself, Jeff, I want to thank you for taking your time out to join us. We are going to put links in the show notes to both the paper and the manifesto itself. We're inviting all of our listeners, all of our fans, to check it out, take a look, let us know what you think. Let us know how successful you are with using it. You got any suggestions, edits? Let us know. We're an open book. So on behalf of Andy and myself, Jeff, I want to thank you for taking your time out to join us. Right. On behalf of Andy, Jeff, and myself, I want to thank all of our listeners once again for listening. You know the drill. We've got a Discord server out there, which is bumping. We have there's a whole lot of conversation going on. We had a conversation the other day about what are the best books every Agile practitioner should read. We have another conversation going where people are signing up to find coaching partners and then finding someone who they don't know to walk them through coaching scenarios, which is great. So we have a very healthy Discord server. We'll throw a link to that. If this is your first time listening to us and you like what you heard, give us a review, give us a rating on Stitcher, iTunes, Google Podcasts, whatever your podcast platform of choice is. We also have a discourse server, the coalition.agileuprising.com, where you can find links to all sorts of great information. And last but not least, we also have a Patreon as well. If you're interested in contributing to the show, which will always remain free, we will never tell you no. So once again, on behalf of Andy, Jeff, and myself, I want to thank all of you. And this is Uprising Podcast signing out.
Have a beer every time you hear the word flow.
Thank you very much.